So I thought that to mix things up a little and to learn something a little bit different. So we learn a mimer from the Rebbe that I'm working on now. And the Rebbe said this in Tafshin Memtes. Sorry, in Tafshin Memvav. He gave it out after the Rebbetzin was nifter. After 11 months, right? Kafal of Tevis. So this is a tremendous mimer. It makes a lot of order in a lot of very complex issues that really interest people. You know, what is the resurrection of the dead? What is the world to come? All this. So he says, "Na'avin inyan tchiyat hametim," to understand the issue, the topic of tchiyas hamesim, the resurrection of the dead. Hinei ita b'Mishnah, it says in the Mishnah, in the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin, the first Mishnah, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek la'olam haba. All of Israel have a portion in the world to come. V'yadua, and it's well known. Where is this written? In the Bar Tanura. The Pirush Olam Haba b'Mishnah zo hu Olam HaTchiyah. Here, when it says that all of Israel have a portion in the world to come means the world of the resurrection. Because sometimes world to come, as we'll see, means the Garden of Eden, which is the world after the soul departs the body.
If it's done good things. Or it's been brought through the washing machine.
As we'll see, that it's not related to doing good things. We'll see soon. There's one of the things that needs to be ordered, because it's all mixed up in people's heads. Is that it's proven from the continuation of the Mishnah, and you can see that this is the right interpretation of world to come in this Mishnah, because the end of the Mishnah says, and these are those who don't have, these are the people who don't have a portion in the world to come. And the first one that it lists is anyone who says there is no world to come from the Torah. And it doesn't mention it in the Torah. By the way, where does it mention it in the Torah? There's a sikha related to this week's parsha that we just read on Shabbos, Azinu. And the sikha is on the words Machatzti v'ani irpa, ani amit v'achayeh, Machatzti v'ani irpa. He says, I squash and I heal, and I amit, I put to death, and I give back life. So the Rebbe says, very in the Gemara in Psachim, he mentioned the Gemara in Psachim. The Gemara in Psachim asks, why do you have to have both things? If God can heal, the other way around. If He can give back life, of course He can heal. Right. So why does it say, I will put to death and I will give life again? And I am the one who squashes and I am the one who heals. Why do you? It's kal v'chomer. It's a major and minor argument. So the Gemara says there that this is in order to answer the possible question that people might have, which is, how do we know that the person who died is a person who was brought back to life? How can we know that? We didn't know them. So somebody comes back to life. How do you know that it's them? So he says, what?
You ask him where it's been.
He said, but how do you know it's them?
Mm-hmm.
He says, how do you know? So you could say that it's like, meaning, to say it a little bit easier, maybe what this verse means is it's true. There are people who die every day, and there are people who are born every day. It doesn't have to be the same person. It's not a reincarnation. It's not anything. It's a cycle of life in the world. It's a natural thing. How do we know that this is talking about resurrection of the dead? That someone who died is now brought back to life. So says the Gemara there that just as when a person, the reason that it brought the second part of this statement, that I will squash and I heal, in the same way that when a person is ill and he gets well again, it's the same person. So know that when I'm talking here, the verse is talking about somebody who died and then came back to life again.
Maybe the very fact that someone is healed when he was very sick, that is in itself.
100%. But we mean much more than that. That's why there's two. But the argument to take from one part of the verse to the other is that just as the person who was healed was the same person who was sick, so the person who comes back to life is the same person who died. This is a very big deal because it's a chiddush. It's a tremendous chiddush. Because we'll see how tremendous this chiddush is. But usually, you could argue that the fact that people are given life, meaning that there is a soul and it's given life, you could say that that's just the natural order of things. There's nothing special about it. But the idea of resurrection
is very special.
Yeah, it's special, but
the fact that Hashem has mixed what you call it, and the Ruchnistic is very special.
Right, but the point is that Rabbi Akiva was asked by somebody, why is there no mention of resurrection of the dead in the Torah? So first of all, we see that there is a verse. The verse in this week's parsha, Na'azinu. Ani amit v'achayeh. We said, it could be that it's talking about the regular cycle of life. Things die and things come back to life. So Rabbi Akiva was asked, why is it not mentioned in the Torah? So he didn't mention this verse. His answer was very interesting. He said, you don't need the Torah to reveal this to you. What do you mean you don't need the Torah to reveal this to you? He said it's a simple logical conclusion. What's the argument? The argument is, if somebody who wasn't alive was given life, meaning there was a soul who wasn't in this world, and now suddenly you see it here. So all the more so that somebody who already had life can come back to life. It's easier. Right? If there was something came out of nothingness, and now it's already here, the fact that the body died is not such a big deal, because the big novelty was the first time that he came into the world. That he should come in again is not. You don't need the Torah for that. This is just logical. It's like saying if you could heat water once, you can heat it again. If there was no way to heat water, then it would be a big novelty if somebody figured out how to do it, right? But once you figured out how to do it, so it just follows. It's just easy. But what's the problem there? The Rabbi Akiva doesn't necessitate, his argument doesn't necessitate that there is something like that. He might say, yes, it's possible to heat water a second time. It's possible for a person to receive a second lifetime. But it doesn't have to happen. There's nothing that necessitates it. And here this verse is saying that just as when a person is healed, it's the same person as the person who was sick. So I'm telling you that the person who will come into life, that I will give life to, is the same person that I put to death. So that you should know that there's Tchiyas HaMesim, there is a resurrection of the dead. Okay? What's the issue then? The issue is that you need a lot of faith to believe in this. That it's possible, we know it's possible. In fact, today, if you ask somebody, how is the resurrection of the dead going to happen? So,
I didn't know. I never came back from the dead.
What?
The standard answer is I never met anybody who came back from the dead, so I don't believe it.
So that's not true. You know people that came back from the dead,
No.
except they were mostly dead, right?
No, that's what the
So the way
unbelievers.
that a modern person will say, of course there can be resurrection of the dead, because it's just a matter of learning more about nature. Eventually we'll figure out how to rebuild a person from his DNA, or I don't know from what else. We will learn how to store consciousness. We'll learn this, we'll learn that. We'll be able to do it. So technically it already doesn't seem to be such a big problem. Meaning it doesn't seem to be impossible. I don't know if it's not a big problem, it's a huge problem. But it doesn't seem to be impossible anymore. So it's easier for people today to believe that something like this could happen. Except that most people will go in the direction of this is going to happen in the sense of some technology that we're going to learn about. Okay? So it's already believable.
Yeah, you can put somebody's heart in somebody else's body.
Maybe you can put the and so on. So, but that's not what this. That's not what resurrection of the dead is for a Jew. It's not the technical aspect. It's not the technical question. Why is it not the technical question, technical aspect? Because the whole idea of continuity from the person who passed away to the person who is brought back to life is that it's not about whether or not you can bring somebody back to life or not. It's a question of, is life complete without resurrection of the dead? Meaning, when we look at our lives, when we contemplate, what is the purpose of life? Okay? Is life a 70, 80, 90-year-old affair, a year-long affair? Or is it something much more than that? How do you define your life? How do you look at it? So a person can say, when I was 30, I didn't think I'd ever die. 40, I didn't think I would ever die. 50, 60, 70, I began to think, I'm probably going to die. And then he begins to live his life a little bit differently. It affects him. He starts living his life in a different way. But how much more would you live your life differently if you knew that it is part of life to achieve the resurrection later on?
What about the possibility you missed out, which is Pinchas is Eliyahu is Pinchas?
That's reincarnation, something else. That's not resurrection. Resurrection is that the same person.
Maybe it's the same person.
No, again, reincarnation is something else.
How do you know it's reincarnation?
Because reincarnation means that the soul comes into a different body.
But maybe
it's not the same one.
Maybe it's
No, so there we accept that it's reincarnation. That's what they meant. It's an early language for reincarnation. So there was either he lived for a very long time, which is probably not very likely, because nobody lived for 400 years in those time periods at least. And what is more likely is that he's a reincarnation, that there was a string of people who, from the time of the Exodus, Pinchas was in the Exodus, and then 400 years later you have Elijah the prophet, and people saw that it's the same person. In the same way that Eve saw that her third son was a replacement for her second son. That Seth was a replacement for Abel. That's much more likely what the sages mean. Okay. In any case, they don't mention it this way or that way. So, and they would have made a big deal. There is 3 times in the Tanakh, in the Bible, that somebody was brought back to life, and that's not considered one of these times. Okay, so, getting back to the point. The point of resurrection of the dead is not to talk about something theoretical, hypothetical. It'll be like this, be like that. Oh, it's all these interesting things because, it's really interesting to think about this. This is really... The point is that this is supposed to affect the way you live. And if you know that your life is not over when it's over, maybe that affects how you live. And he comes and tells you, look, don't be afraid of death. Don't be afraid to die, because it's not over. But more importantly, but more importantly, use your life the right way, as we'll see, in order to build yourself properly so that you can take advantage of this other lifetime, of this eternal lifetime that comes later. Because there's got to be a difference between them. If death is separating them, then what you can do here in this lifetime is different than what you will do there. And that's the most important thing that the Rebbe is going to discuss. How is it different? And so why is it that, or how is it that what we do in this lifetime determines what we will be able to do in eternal physical life of the resurrection? It almost would say that if a person believes that he's going to heaven, okay, and he's not afraid to die because of that, because he thinks that his consciousness will continue, so that allows him to do many things. I saw a really, I read a plot of a movie that I haven't seen. I don't know what the movie, I don't even remember what it's called, but I saw that Robert Redford was in it.
What's a movie, please?
A movie, yeah, one of the moving pictures, you know.
Never.
So, it's a very interesting premise. It says, some scientist proved that there is consciousness after death. He proved it. What did that cause people to do?
Change their attitude.
Right. In what way? So,
Careful
you and
what
I
you-
would think,
Careful what you say.
Right.
Careful what you think.
you and I would think that you would want to be a better person. The premise there is so different, but it's you see how the psychology is completely different after you learn Torah and when you don't have Torah. The premise of that movie is that people start committing suicide in mass. Because why suffer through the pain of physical existence if your consciousness continues anyway? So the whole premise is that if anybody would prove that there is life after death in the sense of a Garden of Eden, in the sense of spiritual life, conscious life after death, it would cause many, many people to commit suicide, to want to leave this world. Because why would I? What would it do to a Jew? It would say, oh, I'm not afraid to spend my every single iota of my being and every single moment making my consciousness better, doing more mitzvahs, bettering myself. I don't have to fear the fact that I might be uncomfortable here. I don't have to fear the fact that it's difficult here. Because now I understand. I'm building my consciousness to continue on afterwards. But somebody who doesn't have Torah, and he doesn't see the purpose in life anyway. So if you just show me that I'll continue anyway, why would I want to suffer what you need to suffer here? Why would I want to go through this? It's this amazing premise. I read it, I was like shocked. I never would have thought that. I never would have thought. I thought that people would commit suicide when we come to a world in which you don't need to work because they won't know what to do with themselves. But I never thought that if somebody, and I think they're right, that if somebody would prove that consciousness continues after death, many people would commit suicide right away.
Interesting thought.
Okay, so the whole premise here is that in the same way that knowing that there is a Garden of Eden, meaning that there is a continuation of the consciousness after death, that changes the way you live. So all the more so knowing that there is a second chapter to life, which is eternal and in a body that is different, or however it is, it's a body that never ails and it's always perfect, and it's eternal. That changes what you do here. Why? Because what you do here, in a sense, sets you up for what will happen in the world of the resurrection. And that's what he wants to ascertain. What is it about life now that affects the world of resurrection and your life there? Okay?
Uh-huh.
So the first thing he says is that the Mishnah, the end of the Mishnah says, who is the person who doesn't have a portion in the world to come, meaning in the world of the resurrection? Somebody who doesn't believe that there's a resurrection. And he says, what is this? Midah keneged midah. The Gemara says that this is a measure for measure. It's very interesting, because what is the Gemara saying? The Gemara is saying, let's say you were mamash tzaddik, you did everything right,
But you didn't believe.
but you didn't believe in the world of the resurrection, so you won't have won't have a part in the world of the resurrection.
Okay.
What kind of deal is that? That doesn't make a lot of sense. The person was mamash tzaddik, was righteous. He took care of everybody around him. He sacrificed his life to help others.
You didn't really believe in Hashem.
So what? Why didn't he believe in Hashem? He believes in Hashem 100%. He just doesn't believe. He maybe even believes that there's a resurrection there. He just doesn't believe that it's from the Torah. He doesn't believe there's a pasuk in the Torah that says there is. What do you mean he doesn't believe? He learned, and he came to the conclusion that this is not what the pasuk says. How can you say that such a person won't have a part in the world to come, in the world of resurrection? It's a very harsh punishment. So right away you see that having faith in the resurrection of the dead is not just faith. It's not something passive.
It's a cardinal point.
It creates in you the instrument or the vessel that allows you then to take part in the world of resurrection. It's a very important point. Faith here becomes a faculty, like we talk about it a lot of times. Faith is not some passive idea. It's a faculty that you have to use. And then it becomes even more a question of, okay, so when I really believe that there's a world of resurrection, what does that mean technically in my life right now? Because if it's a faculty, it must be that I'm living in a different way. That becomes a big question. So what is it that changes in me? How does my vessel change? My body, let's say.
But there are many other instances of people who do not have a portion in the world to come, even though they did their own good deeds.
Uh-huh. Why?
It's
Because
not the only one, and it's not.
Yeah, but this is the main one.
It's not a unique.
The other ones are
You go around calling somebody shorty, spotty, baldy,
then you have a part in the world to come, of course.
No, it's just you don't.
No.
There are nicknames to people.
No, it's not true. You're talking about something else. We'll see. That's not true. Absolutely not. Averas are not something that takes you out of the world of the resurrection, per se. Because it says, everybody has a portion in the world to come, unless he doesn't believe in the world to come. The world to come is like the faculty, belief in the world to come is like the faculty that prepares you for that world. And the question is, how does it prepare you? What does it do? וזהו כל ישראל יש להם חלק לעולם הבא, דבגן עדן כתיב מי יעלה בהר השם, נקי כפיים ובר לבב. It says, this is how the world of resurrection is different than the Garden of Eden. What's the Garden of Eden? The Garden of Eden is just a spiritual state. Okay. So whether the person's alive or dead, he can be in the Garden of Eden. Because there's a Garden of Eden down here, in our world, and there's a Garden of Eden in the supernal world. The difference between them is that you normally cannot be in the supernal Garden of Eden while you're alive. Okay. But there are some people who did enter, there's 10 people mentioned in the Medrash, who entered the Garden of Eden while they were alive. And it says that they even entered with their bodies. So the one way of understanding it is, what I mean, that after they passed away, they took their body with them. That's a little bit of what it means. But the first thing it means is that even when they were here in this world, they were able to access the higher Garden of Eden. But anybody can access the lower Garden of Eden. What's the lower Garden of Eden? It's a spiritual state that a person can enter in this world. It's called the Garden of Eden. It's very similar to how you are without a body. That's why sometimes it's called that you have to strip yourself of your physicality in order to enter the Garden of Eden. So when does it happen? It happens when a person is learning, sometimes when a person is davening. Then they can enter into the state and they're in the lower Garden of Eden. But the higher Garden of Eden, he says here, is dependent on how or what a person did in his toil in this world. Because it says, Mi ya'aleh be'ar Hashem, who will go up the mountain of God? Who will ascend the mountain of God? Someone who is of clean hands, meaning that he's not wronged anyone. Uvar levav, and a clean heart. שישנם כמה תנאים כדי לזכות לגן עדן. So there are conditions when talking about meriting the Garden of Eden after we pass away. Certainly when we're alive. And there's certain things that need to be fulfilled. But that's not the case regarding the resurrection. The resurrection, everybody has a portion in, regardless of what they did or didn't do. That's what it says. Kol Yisrael יש להם חלק לעולם הבא. וצריך להבין, הרי ידוע שהגילוי שיהיה בעולם התחייה הוא נעלה הרבה יותר מהגילוי בגן עדן. So this immediately raises a question. You have to go in 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
מתי משקיעים?
6:40? 6:35? 6:30? 6:30. 6:30.
Okay.
This immediately raises a very big question, because how can you say that when it comes to the resurrection of the world of the resurrection, everybody has a portion, regardless of what they did? But in the Garden of Eden, not everybody, there's conditions. You don't get a free ride.
No free rides.
But ידוע שהגילוי שיהיה בעולם התחייה הוא נעלה הרבה יותר מהגילוי בגן עדן. But it's known that the revelation of godliness in the world of resurrection is much greater than the revelation in the Garden of Eden, meaning in the spiritual world after you pass away. וכמובן, גם מזה שהגן עדן ישנו גם עכשיו, מה שאין כאן הגילוי בעולם התחייה רק לעתיד לבוא. Another reason is because Gan Eden exists now. The Garden of Eden exists now. You can access it now. Whether it be the lower Garden of Eden, which you can access as a human, or whether it be the higher Garden of Eden, which you access after you pass away. But it's here. It exists. But the world of resurrection is going to only be created in the future. It's not here yet. ויתרה מזה, and moreover, הגילוי בעולם התחייה יהיה גם לאחרי ימות המשיח. There's a state in the middle, so now we have 4 states already. He hasn't mentioned them yet, but we can already say. There's our reality now. There's the Garden of Eden, which is the state of the soul after the person passes away, and the soul departs the body. Then there is what we call the epoch, or the age of Mashiach, the times of Mashiach, which is here in this world. They have a physical body. So people who are departed, okay, they don't necessarily have a part in the time of Mashiach. Okay, somebody who passed away 200 years ago didn't live into the days of Mashiach. Of course, there's opinion in the Talmud that the days of Mashiach started 1,782 years ago. It started in the year 4000. But anybody who was before that, for certain, did not have a part in it. But this is a third stage. And the fourth stage, which happens during the time of Mashiach, or immediately afterwards, is called the world of the resurrection. Again, when we say that it doesn't...
It's another 100 years after us.
What?
I thought it's another 100 years.
No, there's different opinions. One opinion is that it's 40 years. Another opinion says 80 years. The third opinion says 120. In truth, the Rebbe said these are different options, and in reality, the resurrection can happen immediately, concurrently, with the time of Mashiach. So from the moment that there's Mashiach, there can already begin the resurrection. Okay.
We want Mashiach then.
Okay, and then you get the resurrection right away if you really want to know.
Okay.
So the resurrection is even higher than the revelation that will be in the time of Mashiach then, because it comes after. It can be concurrently, but the times of Mashiach have to start. So the revelation of godliness in the times of Mashiach has to start before the resurrection can begin. Why? Because it's an ascent. So the resurrection is even higher than the time of Mashiach. And this is what we say on Shabbos morning. This is a very famous, right, prayer. Ein aroch lecha Hashem Elokeinu ba'olam hazeh. There is nothing to compare you to. There's no comparison to you, Hashem, in this world. Right? So that's the first stage. Ve'en zulatcha melkeinu l'chei olam haba. And there's no one but you are king in the world to come. Where here the world to come means the Garden of Eden. Efes bidcha go'aleinu limot HaMashiach. There is nobody who redeems us like you, our Redeemer, in the time of Mashiach. The third stage, and there is no one who saves us like you in the time of the resurrection of the dead. So these are the 4 stages. So they go from below to above. So that the world to come dimensions in this prayer is talking about the Garden of Eden. It's the second stage. You get something more than you could get in this world. What is the Garden of Eden built on? The Garden of Eden, we've talked about this I think many times, is the receiving all the Torah that you couldn't fully understand in this world.
Oh, that sounds good. I like that.
It says that there's 13 rivers of pure parsimon. That's an image. An image for what? For understanding. That you get to understand, meaning, it's almost like Reb Nachman built it this way. He said, it doesn't matter how much you understand, just learn. Why? Because after you pass away, you will understand anyway. But if you didn't touch it in this world, if you didn't touch the sugya at all,
then you can't reveal
it can't be revealed to you when the soul is departed from the body. Because again, what's the argument? The argument is like this. The soul doesn't have a problem to understand Torah. It really can. The problem, the limitations are always from the body. It's either my mind is too dense, I don't get it, or my time is too limited. I didn't have time to really think it through. But after I pass away, all these, call it little vessels that I've built of understanding this issue and this issue and this issue, that's why it was so important for him that every year a person finish all of Torah. What does it mean to finish all of Torah? To learn all of Shas, Bavli Yerushalmi, to go over the entire Shulchan Aruch, to go over the entire Zohar, and of course Likutei Moharan. And the moment that you do that, then in the Garden of Eden you get all of it. Okay? So we'll continue.
But you're going to have to go through it again with Hashem and explain to you.
No, with you get to go through it with the people who wrote it.
Okay.
You don't need to Hashem in there.